12 Years a Slave. The film opens with a group of slaves learning how to cut sugarcane. A guy monitors the men's work from atop a cart loaded with raw cane root. After viewing the dark juice of blackberries in a group of shacks where slaves are now eating fish, Northup is inspired to make ink and a quill. Unfortunately, the strategy does not work, since the juice is just too thin. Later, in the cramped slave quarters, a lady stirs in her sleep and makes a sexual move at Northup, using his hand as leverage. Finally, the title card flashes as Solomon recalls happier days spent with his wife and children. We see snippets of Solomon's life as a free man in his hometown of Saratoga, and he's a brilliant violinist in high demand. Later that night, after putting the kids to bed, he discusses with his wife who will soon take the kids with her to work as a cook, and he mockingly expresses his dissatisfaction at not having her cooking. He sends them off in a carriage the next morning. Later that day, he meets up with a buddy who introduces him to Brown and Hamilton, two strangers who claim to work for a touring circus. They promise he'll return before his wife and give him a big quantity of money to accompany them to Washington, D.C., so it's natural for him to want to join them. The party is later shown dining in a DC restaurant, where his customers hand him a bag of greater money than they had promised. They both sip wine, and one of them maintains a tight eye on Solomon while he drinks in. Everyone is having a fantastic time until Solomon unexpectedly awakens while tied to the floor of a filthy cell. His companions drive him to his hotel room, and in a series of flashbacks, he explains his intoxicated state to the other guests. Braun informs Hamilton that time is running out and they need to get this over with. As they leave, we rejoin Solomon in the cell, where he is informed that he's a fugitive Georgia slave. Despite his claims to be a free man, he lacks identification. Solomon is relentlessly abused and finally placed into a slave enclosure with other prisoners. He discusses his predicament with Clemens, a seemingly intelligent slave who cautions him on the seriousness of their position. Eliza, the mother, and her daughter are soon brought to the corral to join a court's son. She attempts to keep a brave front as they're taken from their cell, bound, and brought to a riverboat under the cover of night. They're escorted to the hold, which is already overflowing with human cargo. Clemens reiterates his advice that Solomon maintain a low profile and hide his abilities to read and write. When they see another slave, Robert, who desires to mutiny and gain control of the ship, they consider their choices before opting to remain cautious. Later that night, a slaver comes to the hold and wakes Eliza in order to rape her. When Robert attempts to intervene, he's stabbed and murdered. Clemens and Solomon are suspected of dismembering the body and disposing of it in the river, causing Clemens to comment that Robert is better off dead. They soon arrive at a pier where Clemens' master awaits them with a demand for the recovery of his stolen stuff. Solomon's lone companion has died, and Clemens joyously scampers into his master's lap, forsaking all indication of his previously exhibited cleverness. A slaver with the ironic moniker Freeman summons his new property to their feet. He approaches Solomon as Platt after disembarking by announcing their names, which he plainly does not know. Solomon is slapped for refusing the name, and nude slaves bathe in buckets before Freeman's officers, displaying the indignity of his slave enterprise within. Customers, a wealthy plantation owner Ford, displays his interest in Platt and Eliza when he presents his sales pitch to devour her. She begs him to take her children as well, but the freeman refuses, and her son is immediately sold to another buyer. Ford attempts to purchase her daughter, who's definitely of mixed lineage, but Freeman refuses to decrease his asking price. Finally, Ford can only afford two. Eliza is upset and yells aggressively, disturbing the sale in an attempt to lighten the situation. Solomon is tasked with playing the violin as Ford returns his items to his plantation. Eliza had been crying the entire trip. Finally, Ford's wife insists that eating and sleeping will help her forget them. The slaves meet the Beats, a slave handler, and Ford's overseer, Chapin. The slaves continue cutting wood until they come upon a small band of local people, with whom they take a little respite the next morning, while the Beat sings a taunting song, urging them not to run. Solomon sees a stringed instrument and thinks of his own violin. Despite Clemens's advice, Solomon approaches Ford the next day with a clever proposal to convey the logs via river. Despite the fact that T-Beats is extremely condescending, Ford is won over by Solomon's opinions and is persuaded, while T-Beats feels embarrassed. Ford awards Solomon with a violin when the strategy is successful. Back in the slave quarters, Eliza is lamenting the loss of her children, and Solomon talks with her about enduring Ford's fair treatment. Ford must definitely be aware that Solomon is not a slave after growing upset by the ruckus, but Eliza responds that Ford does nothing to release him, causing Solomon to pause. Ford's wife finally sells Elizabeth because she can't handle the noise for a few days. T-Beats attempts of small-scale revenge against Solomon, resulting in a dispute. T-Beats attempts to defeat Solomon, but Solomon fights back and wins. When Chapin joins the scene, Beats is forced to go. He wants him that if he runs, he would be unable to defend him and pretends to mend things. T-Beats later collected goons to lynch Solomon for having the courage to challenge him. When Chapin returns with his weapons drawn, the rope is around his neck, and he's about to be hanged. He chases them away, but allows Solomon to stand on tiptoes, hardly able to keep himself upright, as punishment for assaulting a white guy. Slaves emerge from their cabins gradually, but they appear unconcerned about his situation. Finally, water is handed to him discreetly by a lady, who then leaves. After many hours, Ford returns and cuts the rope, freeing Solomon. He pulls him inside for protection, but eventually decides he must be sold. T-Beats, on the other hand, would not give up his right to revenge. In this section, we learn that Ford sold Solomon to Epps, a known plantation owner with a history of harsh beatings. Epps reads a Bible scripture while skewing the wording to bolster his claim to slave ownership. The weight of each worker's bundles is recorded on the day of cotton picking. Ultimately, the yield of Solomon is below average. Slaves who make fewer choices than the previous day are beaten, whereas Patsy generates nearly twice as much as the best worker. Patsy is surrounded by Epps as he lavishes her with compliments. When Epps enters the slave quarters and awakens them, an impromptu dance is performed with Patsy at the centre, which makes his wife sad. Epps' wife physically wounds Patsy by slamming a big crystal decanter at her face. She demands that Epps sell Patsy, but he refuses, claiming that he would rather lose Patsy than his wife. Mr. Epps sends Simon on a chopping expedition. She gives him a list and sees him reading it. She adds that he should not repeat the experience. On his approach to the shop, Solomon is motivated to run, but he comes across a lynching. His spirit is destroyed after watching the destiny of the two men, but he continues to the store, seeing the paper he brings, a spare page with him every time so he may write a letter. Later, Epps sends Solomon to a shorn farm in the region with the intention of elevating the status of one of his slaves by marrying her. Patsy is there admiring the finery, but it appears that Epps is jealous that Shaw may try to woo her. After a brief moment of rest, Solomon persuades Patsy to accompany him back to Epps' plantation, where he's clearly drunk. Patsy hears Solomon telling her to avoid Epps in a whisper, which Epps misinterprets as sexual excitement, and Mr. Shaw steps in. Epps walks to the slave quarters after a frenzied chase around the yard, if only to express her displeasure with her husband's obsession with Patsy. Later that evening, she raped her mistress, Shaw Rubberman's Patsy, as retaliation for her husband's infidelity, before viciously chopping her face. Later that evening, Patsy asked Solomon to murder her by hanging her and burying the body, because she couldn't carry the burden of Epps's rapes and his wife's misery any longer. Because of Solomon's aptitude, the judge offers him to a neighbour searching for music for a party. Solomon may easily draw analogies between his forced slavery and his former status as a free man at the fancy costume party. It's time to travel back to Epps' farm, according to the justices. Patsy's gory death hints that her tortures have continued now that the celebration has stopped, as Solomon passes the house on his way back from the fields. After the cotton crop is harvested, a white labourer called Armsby joins them. Despite generating much less than any other worker, he chooses to produce money in order to get back on his feet. He's free from the whipping that all other slaves must face. He attends to Solomon's wounds and shares his tale in the quarters, and he appears to be a decent guy with a sympathetic ear. Solomon decides to take a gamble by entrusting him with shipping a letter to the north in order to gain his release. He hands Armsby all of the party progresses and swears him to quiet in 2 days. After making ink, Solomon begins writing the letter just that evening Epps' walk. Solomon outdoors after entering the quarters, Armsby breaching his promise and revealing it all to Epps. Thankfully, he narrated his tale before Solomon handed him the letter. Solomon, thinking quickly and capitalizing on staying for slaves, he turns the narrative around. He accuses Armsby of lying in order to earn favour and a job. Solomon is spared after Epps is persuaded by the story. Later, after burning the letter, Solomon sees his prospects for freedom fade away in the ashes. Later, they come upon a group of labourers who are using Base as a hire hand to build a structure. Base is from the north and has strong anti-slavery ideals, in contrast to the firm pro-slavery attitudes. Chatty discussion going on in front of Solomon drew his attention towards Epps. Gets all worked up about Patsy Epps, believes she's gone because she's vanished. She has just gone to Shaw's plantation to visit a friend, despite his threats to hurt all the ladies as a result of her loss. She attempts to persuade Epps that she is devoted to him and that she went there to buy some soap, a luxury that her ex-wife has forbidden her. Solomon is left to his own devices with the hired hand Base. He asks where he's from, and the answer is Canada, and Simon exhibits impressive knowledge of the nation. When Solomon reveals his severe circumstances to Base and is asked how he's so well travelled, Base believes him and understands the horrible unfairness. As they continue to work, Simon takes a risk and asks Base to send letters to his pals in Saratoga. A carriage comes at the Epps plantation, and an official-looking guy cries out for Platt Solomon. He answers and approaches the man. As sheriff, the man asks him some questions and indicates to another man in the carriage, Mr. Parker, a Saratoga store owner and Solomon's acquaintance. With little pushing, the sheriff is persuaded, and Solomon runs to embrace his buddy. Epps is outraged and makes hollow threats, but the sheriff refutes the reasoning, and Parker joins Solomon in boarding the carriage that will bring him to safety. Patsy, who is present, asks Solomon to give her one more embrace before departing, and Solomon hops from the carriage, walks away, and Patsy collapses in tears. Solomon has been brought inside. He's overcome with emotion as he stands outside his door after being rescued from his nightmare. He sees his family as soon as he walks in. Despite being 12 years older, they were surprised to see him. The son of his daughter and her husband is known as Solomon Northup. The film concludes with them around him and welcoming him home with tears streaming down their faces. He attempted to sue his captors, but was unsuccessful, as shown in a succession of title cards. Instead, Northup became an abolitionist who assisted other fugitives in gaining their release.